It's always, what am I making it mean about me?
Mm-hmm.
What am I making it mean about me? Right? This feeling extremely it's just so like insecure of I'm not enough. Essentially, it kind of all boils down to that. If you question a very surface level thought, it really always boils down to, what am I making it mean about me? And in some way there's a lack. And so if I can kind of dissociate from those thoughts and be independent, right? Even if I'm like a mom and all my family and my kids are all around and I'm having this wine kind of party of one, right? Now I'm independent from that, or from, whatever it ends up being.
Hello, welcome to the Recover Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Martin John, the Recovery Mentor. On this podcast, we address topics you'll face while on a journey to recovering yourself. That was Mary Wagstaff, who is a holistic alcohol coach for women. And this episode is addressing the wound of independence. We also talk a lot about masculine and feminine energy and how those are shifting. But the big takeaway, I think, is our defining the differences between independent and individual. As this is the July 4th weekend, I find it fitting that we are talking about independence. Here in the US, our Independence Day marks the time when we, as a group, won independence over the British rule. But we still needed each other. And we have to understand that the group is a huge part of the concept of independence. There is an odd idea that independence means on your own. And that idea, which has gotten out of control, is what created the wound of independence. You are not doing anything completely on your own, nor could you. And why would you? Everything we are and everything we do is part of a bigger picture. And that picture is one we can't fathom in a million lifetimes, no matter how long or hard we try. Too many of us are falling for the idea that it is independence that we want to be free. But in reality, it's our individuality that will free us. Individual, a person who is both separate but never divided from the whole. That is what we are. And if we can shift our ideas to strive to be more individuals than independents, we would all feel a little bit more at ease in our own skin.
Mary, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really grateful to have you on, because your work in the sober field is really in line with so much that I do. So I'm really grateful for you to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am so excited, and I also feel the same way. Very grateful to just share this space and time with you to kind of just get deeper into whatever arises. But yeah, that alignment of the messaging of, recovering of the self is just so potent with everything that I share too. And I talk about this idea of awakening. And I think that that's really part of your message in some ways as well. So yeah, so thank you so much.
Yeah, I always like to say, like, let's not let words get in the way of a good conversation. Like, we're all going to have different words for things, yeah. Awakening, recovering, or however, like the old paradigm of recovering is something I always try and step away from, like that recovering from, that idea that like there's this point that I'm walking away from. And it's like, that's fine. We're all walking away from a point, but where are we going? What's more important? Let's really focus that. So when you and I talked initially, one of the things that really sparked my interest is the wound of independence. You had mentioned the wound of independence. When you mentioned it, I didn't look it up or anything like that. I just kind of thought about it in terms of well, what is the wound of independence? And as we were talking, this separation between independence and individual came up. And for me, individual, right, in the word, it's indivisible, right? So you can't take an individual out of the whole because it is not divisible, right? You can't, the whole is made up of individuals, right? And I think when we look at, and that's a place where we're going. And I think that our work in the idea of recovery and the idea of sobriety and the idea of awakening is awakening the individual, because the individual has so much to offer the whole. And when I look at the wound of independence, independence is a really interesting thing, because I don't think because you can't exist alone. You can't exist on your own. And so independence requires the group, but it's not the whole. It is a group that believes in the same thing that the others in the group believe. This is where I look at religion and where I look at AA and where I look at so many groups.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. It's fascinating, right? Because when you kind of break it down in that way, and, as you're talking, I'm thinking, does independence even then really exist? I mean, right?
Like I'd have to say, like, it can't exist. Like, unless you're off the grid and just like trapping and picking berries and things like that, like your independence is like, and even then, like, you're dependent on the berries, you're dependent on the animals, you're dependent on all of the things that are around you. You cannot exist solely alone.
Yeah. Well, and then that's where the wound comes in, right? Because like I was saying, it's kind of it's an illusion. And when we keep reaching for something like alcohol, we keep reaching for something that doesn't really exist. It's an inverted truth. It doesn't really land in reality. I always think about like the inverted tree of life. So like, well, then there's always this disconnect, this lack, this longing, yearning, and then with that comes, I think, seeking other ways to feel fulfilled, usually outside of their self, right? Because you're in there's this, like you were talking about, the group mentality or group think or whatever. A lot of this is fascinating, actually, and this was something that I actually went through. I had this whole notion that I was extremely independent when I was drinking all the time, and I could be by myself, I could travel by myself, I could do all these things by myself, but yet I was drinking the entire time. So I was completely disconnected from myself, right? And so I wasn't really with myself.
And let's use the vernacular of dependent, right?
Right, exactly.
You were not independent. You were very dependent.
I was very dependent. And, and there was that essence of me. Like, I do love to spend time by myself. And so I knew that was under there.
But I knew that there was part of that in me kind of taking the road less traveled, always really being very inquisitive about life, and kind of a natural philosopher, and all of those things, and wanting to know thyself, right? That was always something that was very, very potent in my life from a very young age, always interested in spirituality, all of those things. But when it came time to be by myself without alcohol, I was looking around, and I'm like, oh, okay. If my mind was busy, I was doing something, yoga or, whatever it was, but to really just be. And I had been in the holistic healing arts and mindfulness world for 20 years, right alongside of alcohol, right? And so it was right there for the taking. It was, again, just a shift of perspective. But I see this a lot, and I do work exclusively with women, where it's kind of like you having these little parties, right? These little parties by yourself or whatever. And it feels okay to be alone. But it's really that there's this like independence, but the individual, you don't even know who that is on so many levels, right? And so again, another kind of just illusion, this facade, and with the framework of curiosity, and just kind of taking a step back, it doesn't take much to get there, to get to know that person, because you've been walking alongside with that person in so many other avenues, in so many other ways. You just haven't taken the moment to look at it. The other thing I see a lot is labeling of kind of, I don't want to say like disordered labeling, but people not giving themselves a chance at, especially, socializing, feeling like, I just did an episode on this about alcohol being the catalyst for connection. And so we investigate this of, well, what does it really mean to be social? Like, what are the skills really required to go out and to just be human to human with other people, right? And so much of the time, the social anxiety comes from thinking, about what other people are thinking. And so we investigate this, and there's these, you say hi, you get curious, you respond to questions, and you listen, right? Like really simple. And so when we kind of explore the framework of that, people realize like, yeah, that might have been a version of me at 20, but I go to networking meetings, I host meetings at work, I do all these other social things. I go to the school with the kids and I'm not drinking, right? So kind of giving themselves credit where credit's due, not realizing like, wow, I actually can do all of these things. And I just didn't put it in this particular framework because of the associations with alcohol in certain environments and stuff. So, and so people have been labeling themselves, and there's all of the emotions are welcome, all of the trauma and the healing and all of the things are welcome. And I've been through all of it myself, but really seeing that as an individual, however they show up is perfectly how it needs to be. And there's no rules about it, right? It's just the investigation of the thinking. And without that, like you were talking about the commercialism of saying like, oh, it's better this way, without the investigation of it, it's like, oh, well, no, actually I'm okay, right? And I can give myself a chance at trying a new way. So that's how I've seen some of it come up. And yeah, so a lot of it is really through that lens of independence. And then how do I relate as myself to myself as an individual? And are those thoughts true? And who am I?
It's interesting as we're talking, like independence almost requires other people, where individual, like you can still be, you can always be, but independence means like separate, like it almost in my mind, it's like, in order to be independent, it requires there to be something you're pushing against. Independent opposed to what?
Right. Yeah.
Because like you can't be independent if everything was independent. We're talking about addiction and we're talking about all these things where it's like you're dependent.
Yeah.
You're absolutely dependent. We're dependent on our neighbors. We're dependent on, we were dependent on our families to get us to, 18 or 16 or whatever age it was that we left, or, and maybe even beyond. And that's an important sort of understanding. It's like to be here and to be like, we can be individuals and very much dependent on the world around us,
Yeah.
and the individual doesn't change. But the independence is like a stance one takes. It's not about you, it's more about a stance.
Yeah. Well, and I see it coming from the way we relate to people. I mean, the way we relate to everything, right? We're ego-centered beings, right? And so if I can dissociate enough from my thinking, then all of these thoughts that I have about myself, because when it comes down to most of it, I can't tell you, it's always, what am I making it mean about me? Mm-hmm. What am I making it mean about me, right? This feeling extremely, it's just insecure of I'm not enough, essentially. It kind of all boils down to that. If you question a very surface level thought, it really, really always boils down to what am I making it mean about me? And in some way there's a lack. And so if I can kind of dissociate from those thoughts and be independent, right? Even if I'm like a mom and all my family and my kids are all around and I'm having this wine kind of party of one, right? Now I'm independent from that, or from, whatever it ends up being. But I don't think it's really conscious in that way where it's this like rebelling against, we don't even know, right? Our beliefs are created for us sometimes before we're even born. We're born into
well, those are the influences that we live under, right? We live under influences that are all around us. And, it's interesting that you mentioned like, okay, here I am having this party of one independent, but, like the only way you'd be able to do that is by disassociating. Because if you were to be like, my family's important to me, and never have a thought about drinking alcohol, or never have a thought about separating yourself from that and having that glass of wine, or putting yourself in a position where you're, under the influence, or, tipsy, whatever. If that, like, there is such a strong message around, in the world today that just perpetuates this wine mom culture, that that messaging around independence, like, be yourself, like, this is how you treat yourself, this is how this is how you're nice to yourself, is by having a glass of wine. If that messaging wasn't there, is that a natural course for your thoughts to go? And I would argue no.
Yeah.
And that's and that's independence, right? You are being independent from your family. You are separating yourself from something so that you can engage in this activity.
Yeah.
And this activity like, we live, like, we have to recognize that we live under the influence of the marketing that we're surrounded by. We live under the influence of, cultures that are strong within the United States. We live under the influence of our parents. We live under the influence of the education system, the economic system. We live under the influence of all of these things. And those influences that we have, like, we think that we can control, or we can have, like, these are just a matter of course. But we're actually under their influence, and they're doing our thinking for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, I think with women specifically, and I know, just from my own personal experience, some of especially during the pandemic, the rate of increase in alcohol consumption by women was dramatic. And I liken it to women not having the ways in which they connect, which is a lot through community, or, things that they are involved in. And, a long time ago, and this was part of my journey of awakening, and still is in such a huge way, is sacred sisterhood and women sitting together in circle and in ritual, and communing in intimate ways through, the phases of the moon, through understanding, through sharing these real rites of passage of maidenhood, motherhood, transitioning into all these phases of life, right? And that those rituals and those rites of passages were taken away in some ways very intentionally a long time ago. And, we don't want to go into like the patriarchy, but, and so there is no mirroring out in our Western world. And it's coming back. When I first sat in sacred sisterhood circle in a ritual ceremonial way, the awakening that happened inside of me on such a deep level of something that I had never even seen mirrored in my life. And I was raised by very strong women, but through more of a masculine lens, right? And we're all facing that wound. Maybe the wound of independence is the wounded masculine, really, right? I mean, in some ways. But I really believe this awakening of the feminine in our culture is what is happening. And I think that's why there is more of an inquiry into the sober curious movement. What are we really doing here? And all sorts of other movements that we're seeing and we're questioning, right? Because we're under the influence of more of a power over model, right? Under the influence is a power over model, rather than this power with this individual, like, being part of the whole, where everyone has just as much of a, bringing something to the table, right? And I'm not saying, there's been imperfections in all of it as humans have evolved, but for me, and this is something that I offer to my community, is that connection to, and I can use the term the divine feminine, but and this doesn't have anything to do with male or female, but it's just the exposure to something that is not mirrored in our culture, which is how do I lead through the feminine lens, right? How do I lead through the feminine lens which is really the emotional self. That is the individual with power, pleasure, and purpose, that I'm fully human, that I can be fully human with all of my emotions, right? And when that's been buried and not encouraged, we are stifling a huge part of our humanity. And so awakening to your emotional self, awakening to your individual self, it really is part of the process, I believe, of recovering, of awakening, of all of those things, of the healing the wound of independence, is seeing that, wow, there's a way that I can exist in the world that I didn't even know was possible. Like, we used to worship the goddess, right? Long time ago. And, but the goddess doesn't exist anymore, as far as in the cultural terms.
I know that that's not true, but go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, it's like we've lived under the influence of, a
Logic.
white male god, right?
Right. And logic was right. So, I mean, we can talk about masculine and feminine quite a bit. That is like my wheelhouse. So I really appreciate that. And, like, I look at, like, as we move into the spirit brain, right? So, I mean, I look at, you have the gut brain, which is, so that's the masculine, and then we have the heart brain, which opened up, and that was relationship, and that's your feminine brain, and then you have the logic brain, which is your frontal lobe, and then we're opening up to the spirit brain, which is definitely a feminine drive, and that's a feminine drive that we couldn't open to without the overpowering of the masculine in culture. Right. We need that over-structured. So all of the structures that we've built through the masculine, right? Schooling, writing, entertainment, recording, all of the things that are structured kind of exist within the masculine. And so that's been in control for the last like 3,000 years thereabouts. It's been really kind of coming to a head, and now we're at the end of its reign, right? And people do not want to see it go. People, like, there are too many people that are benefiting from it, and it's not about doing. It's not about structure. It's not about writing it down. It's not about doing it right. It's about being here now as an individual. Like, not independent, separate from, not independent, like, and that's such a beautiful aspect, right? And that, I mean, I use masculine and feminine as the terms, but it's like, it has nothing to do with gender. It has to do with how one approaches something. It has to do with how something is done. Like, the feminine, for me, so I read the Tao Te Ching. I don't know if you're familiar, but, the Tao, like, talks about it as, like, beyond the edge of the universe, there lies the Tao. The edge of the universe is your God, your masculine bullshit God, right? The weak-minded God that everybody in religion kind of looks to, right? This idea that, like, there is a God, ultimate God, like, will get upset if you hurt his feelings, if you forget him, right? Don't forget me on Sunday, bitches. Like, it's like, how powerful are you, really? Right. And that's the masculine. That is the weak masculine. That is that, and the masculine and the feminine, like, you can't, I look at it as, you can't experience the feminine without the edge, you have a house, and the house is built of walls and a roof, and that space inside is the feminine. That space inside is what makes that house usable. Without that space, you don't have anything. The walls don't matter so much about what they're made of or how they're made. The roof doesn't really matter, but it needs to be there for me to experience this space. Otherwise, I'm outside, and being outside is great, but all of the energy dissipates. To be able to kind of close it into something and be like, exist within the feminine, but the structure in order to do that, because even beyond the edge of the universe is the feminine. The feminine is the ultimate void, is that which will receive everything. And that's such a beautiful thing. And if we can be here and be who we are and receive that gift of life that we were given individually, and not try and be independent. We can't be independent because we're so connected through all of this,
beautiful femininity or beautiful like void, the space in between ourselves. It's all there, and that's who we are.
Yeah, I love that. It was so beautiful. And I think we have such a privileged moment right now to be able to kind of exhale, because when you're talking about this coming to a head, and things have happened, whether or not they're all intentional or unintentional. It's like you said, opening the spirit brain, because the tipping point, it's like you can't get any further. We can't get any further with like achievement. I mean, humans are always going to want to explore and figure stuff out and alter their minds and go to Mars and whatever. But it's like we have everything we need, right? And it's amazing. I mean, we don't need anything else. Now we get to be human. We get to be in the experience of, wow. And I liken it to yoga often, because, in yoga, you take these shapes, these seats, these postures, these asanas, and it's just this, you get into this really awkward, weird pose that you would never do in your regular life, right? But it gives you this brand new perspective of the shape you get to take, right? And all of these shapes that we get to take as an individual throughout our lifetime. And, curious minds want to know, but from just like, ooh, I wonder what's possible, right? But through the lens of the feminine, the shape of emotion, right? The energy of emotion, of just like, and we started talking about words. It's like, if we could just drop the words and just be in the energy, like, ooh, I'm experiencing like this vibration. How does this feel in my body? I'm in this shape, right? And it's it is the liberation, the human liberation model of unapologetically being human. Because I think that tipping point is like, there's no more unhumaning we can do, right? We've pushed to the max of achievement. And yeah, I think there's this really beautiful moment of surrender. But like you said, like, there's people that don't want that, right? Because we don't need, the external authority. It's just not necessary, and I think that this is the work that you do in so many ways, and the work that I hope to do with my clients in so many ways is guide them to be the complete go-to of authority themselves, of self-authority, and which is different, I think, than independence. As how do I relate, and how do I see it through this lens, and how can I see it through another lens, and just be open. And I'm in such a place right now personally of surrender, and as much as it's possible in this wild world of information. So
yeah, no, I think surrender is a really good word to use. I think that's what, because the world is so clearly focused on rewarding those who are still in the old paradigm, rewarding all of those things. And I think like surrendering to who you are will guide you and help you, you personally, I mean, you personally, yes, but everybody, like, really get to this place of I am, without having to finish that in any other way. I am. And that's it. That's I am. And when you want to say I am a mother, okay, and then I am a, biochemist, okay, and I am the person who goes to church, right? So I am religious, and I am this, and I am that. And as we kind of continue to add to that list, we're only reducing ourselves, and that's where independence comes in, right? I am this thing, whatever this thing happens to be, right? Because you're not independent from the world, you're not independent from your neighbor. You can say you're independent, but if someone comes in and murders you, you're not independent. Right? Like, your death was caused by someone else. Like, you cannot be independent all the time. Like, you are definitely dependent on on so many things in the world.
Yeah.
But an individual realizes that in mutuality, they can exist and allow others to exist as well. In mutuality, meaning that you can be here and I can allow you to be here, and I can be here and I can be allowed to be here as I am, and I can show up as I do.
I think we just figured it out.
Well, I think it's interesting. We went on what seemingly was a tangent in this masculine feminine thing, but as we're moving into this new age, and as we're moving into this new time of the divine feminine, I think that there's something really important happening that is praising the individual. That is praising that individual, that person who is like, you have a role to play. And that's not to say that 50 years ago this was important. 50 years ago this was still dormant.
Mm-hmm.
And the six people that were shuffling it in, most of those people were just, six, like whatever, small number, 6,000 people in the world that were, shuffling in this new paradigm, this new thought that the ether holds, and you and I get to graciously contribute to. Those people had to either be quiet or be pushed against, because the independent was strong 50 years ago. Yeah. The independent was the thing, and we needed the independent to get to where we are today. And there's nothing wrong with the patriarchy. It's just no longer necessary.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that sentiment. I am a full believer that things have evolved, the way that they needed to, for whatever reason. And and I mean, the reason I really was, that came forward for me with the masculine feminine is it was my firsthand lived journey experience of moving from independent to an individual, and how I saw myself. And I realized that, as independent, I was trying to, and this, and it was funny talking about the wave of feminism, because I don't consider myself a feminist at all. But it was like, I was independent by kind of like bellying up to the bar, like a guy, or like, in a man's world. And mm-hmm. These are all like general stereotypes in some ways, but that was what I was mirrored. And so it was like, being an independent woman meant doing it like a man. And like, I saw my mother do that. And I mean, I was very loved and nurtured and coddled, but I saw my mother do that. I saw my grandmother do it. And so it was like, well, how do you do it like a woman? Like, how do you do it like me, or with leading with the feminine, right? And there's not just two boxes, of course, we know this, but it just isn't mirrored. It just wasn't mirrored. And like, I love to just think about women being the healers, of the community, and the go-to for counsel, thousands of years ago, like you were talking about, maybe however long ago, 3,000 years ago. So that for me was something that I was exposed to, really the feminine mysteries that I didn't know existed. But I kind of always felt like there was something missing, because I grew up a little bit in a Catholic church, and I loved the ritual and the ceremony, but I was like, where's the joy? Where is the expression, the human, the mother,
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that's kind of where my shift came, was realizing that there was this big gaping hole of how to be part of the whole as the individual self, because it didn't work in any other way. And then, I just started creating more and more of those containers for myself and seeking them out. But like you said, we can create these containers that hold the energy, right? And that's why I love ceremony and I love ritual, because it kind of creates the container in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that, it's important when we look at this, when we look at these things, we have to recognize that it's not all equal. What was going on in your grandmother's day was not what's going on today consciously, right? Like the veil of consciousness is thinner today. The veil of consciousness is constantly thinning. And looking at the past and looking at now is so, like, for your life, it was really important in your experience to experience something missing, but your mom and grandmother didn't know it was missing. You did. And you get to be this adult now that offers the perspective.
Yeah.
Without that experience of it being missing.
Right.
You wouldn't be here.
Right.
And the reason that you get to is because you came about at a time that the veil was thin enough for you to see. Now, your mom and grandmother are probably very well under the influence of the experience that they're having. And when the veil thinned, they still couldn't see it until it was shown to them, if it ever was. Right? And then when they see it, they're like, oh, well, I kind of understand it, until they can embody it. Yeah. And that's such an important understanding, right? Because like when they come up through the world of independence here in the States, right? Through that independent, like, I'm an independent woman, and what that means is I have a job. And what that means is I pay the bills. And what that means is I pay for my date. And what that means is I am a man in this woman's world. And it's like, or in this world, I am a man, because those are the people that are respected as being independent. And that was true in a time. And it's still true, probably, for the most part. But we're changing that. And that's and just to be a part of that conversation is glorious. Yeah. Because there is no destination. There are a lot of people that are very angry out there about the patriarchy and about all of these things. And I get it. Be angry, because that's your dharma. For me, like, I want to respect the time that we're in and not look back and go, that was wrong, because it probably wasn't for the time.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I don't get very angry about the past. And you said something about embodiment, and I think that is part of it. You know, it's like this, it's just the lived experience of what's even available, right? Right. And the responsibilities that you have. I mean, we kind of started talking about this, about parenting, you know, like, and my mother was a single mother. And so she had to do
belly
those
up to
things.
The bar and do the things just to,
Yeah. And so, you know, in some ways, I feel like I was saying, I feel like this is like this most auspicious time of privilege. And for me personally, where I can kind of do all of it, you know, and get out of my own way. And that's why I want to move forward with the message for all people of, you know, of self-authority and individuality and expression. And I think through that and learning from all sorts of voices and all sorts of people, then like the paradigm is shifting now, and it will continue to shift, and we will continue to awaken to these new ways of being as that veil continues to thin. But just like, you know, the seasons, just like nature, it's like everything, we can't have spring without winter. And
yeah, you know, it's funny you should mention that. You know, one time someone asked me, or I heard someone get asked, let's put it this way. I heard someone get asked, what's your favorite season? She was like, the next one. And I was like, so beautiful, right? Like this idea that like, I can appreciate that which I haven't had for the longest time. Yeah. You know, and that's such a beautiful thing, right? Like just to recognize that what's coming, that's my favorite.
That's my favorite. I love that.
You know, like, and even as we look at the dissolution of the masculine in our society, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to be here. Just like love and romance is still here, but we kind of encapsulated it into the masculine, like, structure of a wedding, right? Like, you know, it's like, now it's like, okay, this is a romance and this is the box that we keep it in, right? like unfortunate, because like it was probably much better before. And then we had to kind of build this structure in order to understand what a relationship is. And we do that. And I think relationship is the strongest form of feminine. But that's every relationship, whether you hate each other or love each other or just friends, and that love kind of exudes in different ways. And it's like the ebbing and flowing from day to day of that relationship is the ultimate of what we got from the feminine. And to be here, to be present in this moment in relationship with everything else, like that's the growth. And I think that when we start to, like as we get away from logic, like we're going to see the dissolution of things like marriage, and we're going to see the dissolution of things like definitions of what it is you think this is.
Yeah, I love talking about as we get away from logic, right? And that really is, I just was talking about this with someone this morning. It's like logically, especially with alcohol, I don't have to tell people what the benefits of not drinking are or what the consequences of drinking are. I don't have to talk about that in my content at all, because that's very logical, right? And but it's this embodied experience of seeing, and so much of it is a natural like maturation process, I really think. But because of this living under the influence of the independence, right? It's so hard to say, could I be just outgrowing this, or could I be choosing something different? And of course, we know alcohol is an addictive drug that changes the chemical makeup of things in your body, and has a big influence on you. But add that to the influence of all of the other pieces of it, of the independence and the story, right, of what it means and the marketing and all of that. Well, now that's the even bigger struggle, I think. That's the even bigger thing to overcome. Because if that wasn't there, the natural part of saying, this isn't, serving me anymore, and I'm going to take a step away from this, it's the attachment to the idea of what it is, where there's not really this ability. And it probably happens in other ways too, but I just see it really strongly with alcohol, where it's like, I've outgrown this lifestyle, or this, whatever this is, it's not good enough anymore. And for me, and I'm awakening to something different than that.
It's interesting you say that, because like alcohol is one of those things that happens at the time you gain your independence.
I know.
And when I look at this idea of like, I got my independence and I can drink, and these two things are linked, and it's like, I'm an independent individual. And, like all of a sudden it's like, to step away from that identity, to step away from that which gave you freedom for the first time, is going to be like, nothing will give you freedom, instant gratification freedom the way that did. And yet, the freedom that you'll get from sobriety, the freedom that you'll get from recovering to who you are, or awakening, or whatever we are sitting here talking about, recovering to a space in your life that is not under the influence of something external from you, is so much more vast than the freedom you gained at 18 or 21 when you were able to drink and get out of from under the house, under the roof of your parents.
Yeah. And I think you can find it without having to go through that journey, but there is something, I say for me personally, alcohol was the greatest initiation of my life. It was the ultimate rite of passage, like the recovering from it was the ultimate rite of passage,
Yeah.
And that's the thing, because when, in a traditional way of a rite of passage would be being independent, but through the lens of the individual, and how now are you going to contribute to the whole, right? If we look at a more traditional version of a rite of passage, being in this liminal space, leaving one version of yourself to join in the ranks of, you were a boy, now you're a man, right? And you go through this process. And here's the tool that we give people, right? The thing that is dissociative, that is disempowering, that is invalidating, that is limiting, and say, now you're independent, right? And
Right.
so that's why, I started talking about this. It's just like the biggest, this illusion, it's this inverted truth. And that awakening from it, it's like, until you have this veil lifted, it's hard to see. It's when you are under the influence of both the chemical and the narrative, right? So,
and this is something that we have to recognize may very well be only now.
Yeah.
Like in the 1920s, we don't know because we're not there. Like there's this whole idea of like, okay, well, yes, we're saying this, but also the veil was thicker, and it may very well have been that you could thin the veil with alcohol, with cocaine,
right,
with all of the things that people were using. Now, we don't need to thin the veil because the veil has been thinned just through consciousness.
Yeah.
And so stepping away from that consciousness is only thickening the veil.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not actually getting us closer to anything that resembles the individual.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, when I think about, the model of AA and other, I haven't been myself part of any recovery communities, but I work with plenty of people that have come through outpatient rehabs, AA, and yeah, it really is that ability to come back to the individual. And I just say, intentionally or unintentionally, however the group was formed, I really think that there was a lot of good intentions, right? And they're just kind of, a lot of it's outdated.
Yeah, same thing with every religion, same thing with everything that's come down the pipe and just like transformed over years and years and years. And it's all like, it's $1 billion industry today. It's $1 billion industry, not because it's allowing people to be who they are, but it's $1 billion industry because they know that, I mean, treatment centers use AA meetings and they charge people an arm and a leg for those things.
Yeah.
And so it's not going anywhere. It's got plenty of heft behind it in the world of logic. Now, there are people that are stepping away from the AA model, but Middle America has no idea what recovery dharma is. Mm-hmm. Like Middle America doesn't have any idea what She Recovers is. So it'll get there eventually as they start to search for new things. Smart recovery's out there. There's so many different opportunities and options for people today that they'll find it. And we have the internet. Unfortunately, when you're hurting from addiction, you just want things given to you so that you don't have to do anything, because you don't want to get out from under the influence, because who's doing the thinking? That which you're under the influence of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely layered for sure. And, that's something I'm so excited to be a part of, is, the other side of that model. Right. And I don't shame or blame anything, whatever works for people to support them. But it's been so inspiring to me in my own personal life to see through the lens of the individual, people be able to get out of from under the influence, right? Yeah. And it takes some sifting through. Everyone's got a different story. Everyone's got different layers. But yeah, I think that there's, I think people are looking for not just a different option than alcohol, but they're just awakening to, what is my experience of this life like? But it's a spectrum, so.
Everything is. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. And I know I'm really glad that we went into all of this, and we may very well have something on our hands that we.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I want to thank Mary Wagstaff for helping us get a better idea of how independence has wounded us. And you can find more information on her at marywagstaffcoach.com. You can also find links to everything she is doing in the description of this episode. Without asking the difficult or slippery questions like, how have I been wounded by my idea of independence, we would never be able to get a complete picture of what recovering oneself would really look like, because everyone is going to do it differently. Because of that, I'm very grateful that my guests are willing to take the journey with me to help get to the bottom of it. Listening to this podcast exposes you to the information and the idea that recovery is about more than sobriety, and that it is for more than people with addiction in their history. I hope this podcast is a light for you, guiding the way to your recovering of yourself. This podcast can be used by counselors and groups to discuss the big picture of what recovery and what recovering ourselves really looks like. Consider heading over to anchor.fm and supporting this podcast with a donation. And while you are there, feel free to leave me a voice message with comments, questions, and criticisms, all of which I would be grateful to receive. Please rate and review this podcast and or leave comments for this episode to help me better create helpful content. As a recovery coach, I take a limited number of one-on-one clients every month, so contact me when you're ready to work together through martinjohn.com. I also accept financial support through Venmo at @martinjohn_Garcia. So if you benefit from listening to this content, please consider supporting my efforts. If you're in Chicago, we can work together at Satnam Yoga Chicago. And finally, you can find me on the Wisdom app for both content and mentorship. Thank you for listening to the Recover Yourself podcast. And until next time, keep recovering yourself.